good many people attending right now, and I just want to welcome you all to our first presentation, our first Zoom presentation for Historic Santa Fe Foundation. I am Melanie McWhorter. I'm the development coordinator at the foundation. I just wanted to start with a few foundation announcements before we introduce Ron. The Historic Santa Fe Foundation offices on Canyon Road, our El Zaguán offices, are currently open. And of course, that's pending any health orders that may come up. We're open 9 a.m. to noon, Monday through Friday. We have a show in the Sala with Galisteo resident Ed Epping. It's the Corrections Project, which is portraits of individuals who were arrested, convicted, and imprisoned, and later exonerated for crimes they didn't commit. So this show runs through January 28th, and we do have a good many of those online. So you can go to historicsantafe.org and find the exhibition, and we'll probably be adding a few more pieces along the way. On December 22nd at 5 p.m., we have another presentation, another salon presentation with New Mexico State historian Rob Martinez on the enduring Hispanic music of New Mexico. So that should be a great great presentation too. And we're splitting all of the donations and entry fees, and we're going to donate half of that to the Empty Stocking Fund, which is managed by Santa Fe Community Foundation. You can find out more about that on their site too. So we'll be recording today's presentation. We've already started recording. If there's any issues, which we don't foresee any, we hope there will be none, we'll follow you up with you all afterwards. Attendees will not be shown on the screen, nor will they have audio, but you'll be able to use the chat window if there's any issues, or if you have questions for Ron after the presentation. That's how we'll read through the questions. So if you do have some, try and get them in early. He's going to speak for probably about, and everyone can see, hi Paula, everyone can see the chat. So try and keep it to a minimum if you can, because it shows to all panelists and attendees. We're going to try and wrap up about 4. He'll present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So I'll read those out loud so that we'll have them on the recording. And for those of you that are new to Zoom, you can change in the upper right-hand corner. It's usually where it resides, from gallery to speaker view. And then when Ron starts his presentation of the slides and the screen share, you can minimize it usually by kind of using the minus symbol. And that'll minimize him being shown on the screen at that point. So I'll tell you a little bit about our speaker today if you don't know that much about Ron. Ron Hart Duncan is the director of the Institute for Tolerant Studies in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He is the former president of the Jewish Federation of New Mexico, and for many years, he has served as the program director of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. He is a cultural anthropologist with a Ph.D. From Indiana University and a postdoctoral work in Jewish studies at the University of Oxford. Hart is a former university vice president and dean of academic affairs who has worked in South America for 20 years with UNICEF, the Ford Foundation, and other international organizations. He has written a number of books on Jewish life and cultural history, and the more recent one is Crypto Jews, The Long Journey. He has also been seen on the PBS special A Long Journey, The Hidden Jews of Southwest, and it's a really great presentation. You can find that online for free too if you want to watch it afterwards. It's really great. So I'm pleased for Historic Santa Fe Foundation to present Ron Duncan Hart on early Jews of Mexico. So thanks, Ron.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to this chance to talk for the next few minutes about this very interesting part of New Mexico history. And you know, it's history is storytelling in a certain sense, as long as you have your facts correct and the information is correct. And what we're looking at, as the early Jewish families were coming into New Mexico, they were coming in as merchants mostly, but there were people in other areas. As we know, the wartime family here was very much involved in cattle ranching, and there were people in mining and logging and all kinds of things. But the very first were really coming in as merchants. And it's largely a tale of 2 cities, Santa Fe and Las Vegas, and largely a tale of 3 families, the Spiegelbergs, the Staubs, and the ILFELDS, ILFELD Nordhaus. And but today I'll take the story up to really from about 1850 to 1900, and we'll look at the early people who were coming in at that point. So let's start with the slides, and just a minute, if I can get over to the screen sharing. Okay, so hopefully you have the first slide on the full screen.
Yes, we can see it, Ron.
And so really going to be looking at the first 50 years, basically. And all right, why is my second slide coming up? Okay, this is the kind of thing that we all look forward to. Let's see. There we go. So the question always comes up, well, we're going to be talking primarily about the European Jews that came in, but what about the hidden Jews that came in earlier? And that's a separate talk, separate lecture, of course. And the indications are that the first Jews actually came in were 1598 with Oñate, and others came in earlier, later. There is some interesting research that has literally just been coming out very recently by Roger Martinez Davila, suggesting that there might have been conversos even with Coronado. And he has some indication that I'm really looking forward to seeing the details on. But we know that from early on, there were converso families in and out of New Mexico, even though it was illegal to be Jewish, all during the time of the colonial period in the Republic of Mexico. So it was really when the U.S. came in and took New Mexico that it began to be possible for Jews to openly live here. We don't have much documentation this very early period of the hidden Jews, and a great deal that we know about it comes from what their descendants in the 20th century have told researchers such as Dan Horthes and others. So as I'd mentioned before, the story is primarily between Santa Fe and Las Vegas, and after the late 1800s, 1900, the story shifts to Albuquerque, basically, but we're going to look at this first stage. Most of the people who were these very early Jewish settlers were coming from Germany. This was kind of the 1850s to 1880s stage. From the 1880s to the 1920s, more or less, there was a second wave of Jewish migration into New Mexico, but that was coming more out of Eastern Europe and Poland, and even to Eastern or Western Russia. But we're looking at primarily the German Jewish families. So, of course, there were push and pull factors that were going on here. And the Comunero revolt in 1848-49 in Germany was one of the things that was a push factor, pushing some of the young Jews out. And the conscription, which was something that was both here in the Prussian army, but later in the Russian army. Jews feared being drafted into the army for a number of reasons. One, because many times the pressure was to not, how should we say, to push down the Jewishness. So there was a fear of that. So one of the things that started happening, especially after 1848, we find young men before their 18th birthday, before they'd be conscripted, their families would send them to the Americas. And this became a pattern of serial migration. And we'll see that later with the Spiegelberg and with the Staub and ILFELD families. So one brother would come first and then bring the younger brothers and cousins and so on. The German Jews were coming out of a Reformed Jewish background, which meant they were socially and culturally Jewish, but not traditionally Jewish religiously in the sense that an Orthodox observant Jewish person might have been. So one of the things that's interesting about this is, here we have the first Jewish families arrived to Santa Fe literally in the 1840s. We don't have a synagogue in Santa Fe until 1955. There's 100 years of Jewish presence here with no synagogue. Now the Jewish families got together and there are evidences of like Shabbat schools for the children and things like that. But there was not a formal synagogue. The first synagogue actually set up in New Mexico was Montefiore in Las Vegas, which you see on the screen, was 1884. The second one's Congregation Albert in Albuquerque in 1897. And in both of these cases, you'll find especially the ILFELD family being involved with the formation of those synagogues. So when they were coming in, New Mexico, the United States had just occupied New Mexico. The economy was basically a barter village economy, agriculturally based. And as you'll see on the screen, for the first 2 or 3 decades, the primary source of cash in the local economy was from the US Army that was buying supplies and buying goods. And the German merchants came in frequently as suppliers. Well, one of their important customers was the US Army, and they would be supplying that, and that would be the cash that permitted them to function. The studies in this area, Richard Meltzer, for example, makes the point about the German Jews really being catalysts for the development of capitalism in New Mexico in this early stage, the shifting of the economy from a barter economy to something where cash was more involved in a more capitalist-oriented economy. And there were other European merchants come in at the same time that were also a part of this. And Meltzer also makes the point about the important thing about the Jewish presence as cultural brokers between the Anglo settlers and the traditional Spanish settlers, and sometimes the Native American groups. In fact, there are stories about people talking about one instance I know, particularly in Las Vegas, where a person was defining the community, and they were saying, they had the Anglos and they had the Spanish, and then there are the Jewish families. So they would literally define the Jewish families as somehow in between, not quite one or the other. The other part of this that's interesting is that the Jewish families tended to be multilingual, and of course they were German speaking coming in. They had to learn English. Some of them actually learned Spanish before they learned English, and some of them actually learned some of the indigenous languages. So there were people who were accustomed to being multilingual, and that facilitated this role as the cultural brokers. Now, the first person that we know can document as being Jewish in New Mexico was Solomon Jacob Spiegelberg. And here we have 1850 plus, but it actually looks like he was in Santa Fe before that, probably arriving in 1846 with the US Army, it looks like. He was a sutler, a supplier for the Army. You can see here that he established a store in 1848 on the plaza. And then we start the serial migration. He begins bringing his brothers. Levi comes first, 1848, then Emmanuel, Lehman, Willie comes last, the younger one, 1861. And Willie is the one who eventually becomes the mayor of Santa Fe. Solomon started the operation, was here for the first 10 years or so, developed some health issues, went to New York. And from then on, the Spiegelberg story is really a story back and forth between New York and Santa Fe. And ultimately, all of the Spiegelberg family winds up in New York. So he went there for health reasons, but as his health got better, he really began supplying the Santa Fe to New Mexico operation from there. So he was the supply end, and the operational end was, of course, here. Another thing that is characteristic of this time that we see with Solomon is that in 1856, he went to Germany because typically all of these early immigrants would come as young men, and then eventually they would go home to Germany to find a wife, to get married, and come back and then have their families here. He went to Germany, married Kathy Steinhardt, and we see this is a continuing practice. So the Spiegelberg brothers, we talked about the serial migration, and you'll find these family shots of the various brothers having their portraits taken. And we find them, the 5 brothers here lined up, and they were all involved in the family business up until 1890, when Willie, who was the last one here, finally sold the last part of their operation and left. The store they set up on the plaza was an important one of these early mercantile establishments here, and we can see the photo. And I'm forgetting the exact date of this photo, but it's 1870s or 1880s, in that range. So you can see what it was at that point. The Spiegelbergs also, and what happened with all of these early families is they were involved in mercantile, dry goods business. And, but at the same time, they were always loaning money because people at local farmers, sheep herders, whatever, didn't have cash on hand. So they would, the mercantile business would, in a sense, loan the money. They would give them the goods, and then when the crops came in or the sheep were sheared or whatever, then they would pay off everything. So there was always kind of a lending process going on. So when the First National Bank was established with Thomas Catron, and Abraham Staub was involved in that, we'll get to his story in just a second, and the Spiegelbergs were left out. So they decided that they needed to have their own bank also, and they opened the Second National Bank, which continued for, as you can see, for 20 years. But as they were winding down their mercantile business, they also allowed the bank charter to lapse. So the second Spiegelberg Bank was the Second National Bank, but it didn't survive in the long term. And of course, we still have the First National Bank. The Catron building that we see here, of course, we will all recognize, and it continues to be a part of our heritage here. Now, Levi and Betty Spiegelberg were important figures in the local scene. One of the things that is worth noting, he helped found the Masons in New Mexico. And one of the things that you'll find all through, you see it in the United States, but I lived in Latin America for 20 years, basically. And one of the things that I found both historically and currently there is that there's always a Jewish involvement with the Masons, and frequently helping to actually organize it. And we see that happening here. When Betty came to Santa Fe in the 1860s, as you'll see, there were very few European women here. And that continues to be a story as the Julia Staub later, when she marries Adele ILFELD, when she comes, there's always this commentary because there were few European women present here, and there was always there was always a mention of that. One of the things, Flora Spiegelberg, and we'll see in just a minute, was a great storyteller, and she tells a story of in the 1860s. There was a time when Santa Fe was at least briefly occupied by a Confederate unit that came into town, and they were taking goods from the Spiegelberg store and other stores. And the story that Flora tells is that Betty heard a screaming, a young woman screaming, crying in the street and asking for help. And she was supposed to stay inside, but she was concerned about what was going on. And she looked out and saw that there was a young African-American woman in the street. And she apparently called her husband and said, look, I mean, this, what's going on? I mean, there has to be, something has to be done. So the end of the story is apparently this young woman was a slave that was with the troops. And apparently there were 2 or 3 other men slaves there. The story, according to Flora, was that Levy then bought all of the slaves and gave them their freedom. And that was one of the Spiegelberg stories that has come down to us. The Willie Spiegelberg, who was the last one to come and that we know was the Jewish mayor of Santa Fe in the 1880s. Same story with him. He came originally to work here. Then in 1874, oh, if you hear my, okay, there, my dog was briefly barking. If you see the story there, in 1874, he went back to Germany and in Nuremberg met Flora, and they were married, and then she came. So we have the Willie and Flora Spiegelberg story. They were friends with Archbishop Lamy, Governor Wallace. The Spiegelbergs were donating to the building of the cathedral, of course, as did the Staubs. And it was during the time, during the 1880s, that Charles ILFELD had also arrived and had been building his business base out of Las Vegas. And the interesting thing is his business expanded to the point that it began to impact the Spiegelberg business here in Santa Fe, and their business was declining. So by 1888, Willie sold their house, which, as we'll see here, was 227 East Palace. It is today the Peyton Wright Gallery. So the building is still, the house is still there. The first house with running water and gas light in Santa Fe. It was there that they entertained President Hayes when he was here. Flora started a Shabbat school that I mentioned earlier. There was no synagogue, but we do have some kind of Jewish education going on for children, and there were enough Jewish families with children that she set up this Shabbat school there. Now, Flora is an interesting person, and I want to continue a little bit with her story. As you'll see, after they moved to New York, she published a number of books on New Mexico and New Mexico life. She had radio programs and featured New Mexico stories in those radio programs into the 1930s. Remember, they moved to New York in 1888. So they'd been there for decades when she's really coming back and reminiscing about New Mexico. And there's a story that she came back a couple of decades later. She came back to visit New Mexico and was quite, shall we say, disappointed with what she saw with that Santa Fe had changed so much. So even for her, by 1910 or 1920, Santa Fe was not the Santa Fe she knew, you know. So there some of the stories that she told, and Noel Pugash has very kindly told these stories to me. the Billy the Kid stories, of course, to start with. And one of them says that Flora was on a stagecoach going from Santa Fe to Trinidad, and that along the way, Billy the Kid held up the stagecoach. So he was there with his pistol at the door and had people out there to give their goods to her. And so apparently, as the story goes, Flora looks out and she says, "Billy, you know this is not right." And at that point, Billy the Kid backed off and got on his horse and left. So these are good apocryphal stories that make for good telling. And another story apparently Flora told was that Billy and Willie Willie Spiegelberg, the mayor, when they were both younger, had actually known each other and had gone swimming in the Rio Grande as kids. But Noel suggests that these are surely apocryphal stories, and they probably are, but it's part of the folklore, the legacy. So why were they telling these stories? Noel's explanation is that they did it to link Jewish life to New Mexico culture. And it was a way of making Jews a part of New Mexico. Another story that Flora tells, and that could have happened actually, was that she knew Lew Wallace. And so apparently one day she was walking by the Palace of the Governors, happened to walk by his office, and he had finished the manuscript on Ben-Hur, and was at the point that he needed to get it to New York to the publisher. And so that Flora had told him, I will guarantee I will get your manuscript to New York if you give me a percentage of the profits. And so apparently Lew Wallace then at that point said, "I can deal with it myself, thank you." And so he managed to get it there himself, and Flora, and the rest is history, of course. So the second family becomes important here. So the Spiegelbergs are really the first, starting in the 1840s, 1846 with Solomon, and going on through into the late 1880s. Abraham Staub was the second of the German Jewish families coming in. He was a cousin of the Spiegelbergs. And again, we find these extended family networks coming in. So first it's brothers, but then cousins come. And even we find that connection going on then into Las Vegas. He came in 1854 following his older brother, Zadok. Again, he came working as a supplier for the army. He was linked with the Spiegelbergs in this early process, but fairly early on had set up his own store on the plaza. And he, with his brother, had, again, a general merchandise store that was fairly successful into the 1880s. And again, they were affected also because of the expansion of the ILFELDS later on. Now, the Spiegelbergs simply sold everything and left at that point. Staub stayed and continued the store until he died in 1913. Their story becomes interesting because Julia, again, becomes an important part of the story. Again, Abraham went back to Germany to get married, met Julia. She came in 1860. He'd come in 1854, so 6 years later, 1860, she came. She was only 16 years old. They were married. They lived in Burrow Alley. And Elizabeth Nordhaus, who gave me much of the family story on the Staubs, tells about how distressed she was. Burrow Alley was not a good address. And Elizabeth tells it in terms of, gunfights or at least fights in the streets, and a lot of hustle and bustle that was not her world from Germany. But they lived there a number of years. Now, Abraham had promised her a beautiful house. They didn't have that on Burrow Alley. But, and in the meantime, over the next 20 years, you see they had 8 children, so they had quite a family. This is Julia and other stages. And finally, in 1880, Abraham started the beautiful house that he had promised Julia in the beginning. And you can see that on the right here. Between 1880 and 1882, the house was built. By 1880, the train was just arrived, railroad was arriving. So he was able to bring good furnishings and built what is by all records a beautiful house. It was the most beautiful, he said it was the most beautiful house in the territory, and very likely it was. Julia loved roses. She even had roses included in the decoration in the house. This being the best house in the city at that point, it was the center of social life, and visiting dignitaries stayed there, such as, again, President Hayes, when he was here with his wife, they stayed here in the Staub Mansion. Now, that, of course, the interesting thing about the Staub Mansion and the Spiegelberg Mansion is because they're at opposing corners at Paseo de Peralta and Palace. So you have the Peyton Wright Gallery of the Spiegelberg House. The opposite corner, La Posada, is based around the old Staub House. And now the end of Julia is part of the story. It's been incorporated into La Posada, the Posada that you probably have heard. So only a year after they had moved into the new mansion, the 8th child was born, a daughter, Henriette, but she died only a few weeks after birth. And Julia, by all accounts, fell into a deep depression. Her hair turned white. She didn't come out of her room for weeks. And even after that, this was really traumatic for her. And even after that, she never returned to her normal social life as she had had before. And she essentially lived as a recluse for the next years. So that has been incorporated into the history of La Posada, the legend of Julia's ghost. And so that's the origin of that. On the right, you can see the Staub cemetery monument in the Fairview Cemetery. So in La Posada, if you go there today, you can see above the doorway, once you come in that entrance kind of hallway part, and you go into the door into the main building, above the doorway, you can see the A.S., Abraham Staub, that is still there. And you walk in and you see the stairway, which is the original going to the second floor where Julia's bedroom was. The dining room is original with that rose window, which she particularly liked. And if you look closely on some of the rooms, you'll still see the place where the mezuzah was located. Now, another central figure, of course, in the Staub-Spiegelberg story of early Santa Fe is Archbishop Lamy. And when the part of his story is that as the U.S. took over the New Mexico territory, instead of having the Mexican-based priesthood here, it was important to have a priesthood that the United States understood more. So they invited Bishop Lamy to come and become the bishop in Santa Fe. He arrived in 1851. As you see, he was a good friend with Flora Spiegelberg. They spoke French together frequently. And one of the wagon train story is told by both the Staub and the Spiegelberg families. And from historical accounts, I think most historians would say that it's probably the Spiegelberg version is correct. But from the Staub family, that it's always been a part of their family stories also. And the story was that one of the young men coming on the wagon train that Bishop Lamy was coming on fell ill, apparently with cholera, and the wagon master was going to put him off at some location in Kansas. There was a fear he might not survive. Bishop Lamy said, no, I will take the young man on my wagon, and I will take care of him and try to get him back to health, which in fact did happen. Now, according to the Staub version, the young man on the wagon train was Abraham Staub, and according to the Spiegelberg version, the young man on the wagon train was Levi Spiegelberg. So whatever, but from the very beginning, the point is that Archbishop Lamy was supportive and involved with the Jewish families here. And of course, we know that these two Jewish families and the other families that were in Santa Fe at that point helped fund the building of the cathedral. And but one of the stories there that's interesting is that there was a Saturday night poker game, apparently at Abraham Staub's house, with the local merchants, and the Spiegelbergs were there, and the Staubs and other men were there for the poker game, and that Bishop Lamy would normally come. He would not participate in the game, but he always would come with a bottle of wine, and he would have wine and chat and talk with the people. So one Saturday night he was there, he was very glum, and when they were asking what was going on, he was saying, there just isn't money to finish the cathedral. We're stuck. Again, I think most people agree that this was from the Staub side of the family. That Abraham Staub then, there are different stories. One is that he at that point wrote a $15,000 check and said, here, this will help you fund the finishing of the cathedral. Another story says that he at that point said, I will tear up all of the loan papers for all the money I've loaned you in the building, so you don't have to pay me anything back. But the trade-off was apparently that Bishop Lamy then would put the Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, on the archway in the Hebrew characters. And but as we know from historical sources, that was also a common practice in the province of France where he came, and it does exist in other Catholic churches also. But it's a part of our Santa Fe story at this point. Here you can see a couple of the Seligman, Staub, Spiegelberg young men dressed in their Western uniforms with Kiowa Scouts, just a photo of the time, not quite like the formal portraits that we see in other cases. Now, at this point, the third family that comes in that's important are the ILFELDS. And you can see that they're involved in, we have the Montefiore Cemetery, which is established first, and then the synagogue that was there. Montefiore was one of the most important Jewish people of the time, Sir Moses Montefiore. And it happened to be his 100th birthday in 1884. And this was part of the celebration of, so his name was used. The Montefiore Cemetery is one of the oldest ones west of the Mississippi. Now, I don't know the exact number in the place in there, but it's one of the early ones. And you'll also see they were the cemetery was next to the Masonic Cemetery. And there was also this link between the Jews and the Masons in early Las Vegas. Here we see the building of the early synagogue. The story starts with Louis Ilfeld came and he had followed his older brother Herman, who had arrived, and they arrived first to Santa Fe. The Ellsberg and Amberg were more, a couple of the other families were here. They actually helped finance him to start a business in Taos with a man named Adolf Lecture. So they started the business there. This is the young Charles Ilfeld. It was a business with furs. It didn't go well. There is a famous story of their taking all of their products on 75 or 100 burros down the trail to Las Vegas when they gave up on the Taos operation. And they became established in Las Vegas, and that really became the hub for the future. Charles learned Spanish early on and was one that was primarily the face of the new business with the Hispanic farmers and sheep herders and so on. And he became known apparently as Tio Carlos to them. Adele, She and Adele Nordhaus. Again, we follow the same pattern. Charles returned to Germany, met Adele Nordhaus in 1873. They were married. She came to Las Vegas. And again, what I mentioned before, the Las Vegas Gazette describes her as the most handsome woman in New Mexico at that point. So we get the start of this family. Now, Charles then later brought his brothers and a nephew, Adele's younger brother, and they all become involved in the family business here. Here we see the ILFELD family with Joanna, their sister, and standing in the middle. And again, this family portrait of the extended family coming on serial migration. Charles ILFELD became enormously successful. The company grew and became the largest Jewish business in New Mexico. And as we've seen already, he helped found the synagogue in Las Vegas. It was supportive of New Mexico Highlands University, and the ILFELD House in Las Vegas. You can see here. The figure that becomes important next is Max Nordhaus, Adele's younger brother, who came in and apparently was quite talented, and very quickly Charles gave him equal power within the company, and essentially Max managed the company for the next 50 years in Las Vegas, and ultimately when they moved to Albuquerque. The Charles ILFELD building, you've probably all seen, along with the Palace Hotel that is still there in Las Vegas. The interior of the store, much like was the case in these dry goods stores and mercantile businesses that later were established in various parts of New Mexico, lines and lines of goods and products that people were needing to leave their lives here. The wool market, which they played a major role in. The coming of the railroad made a big difference in Las Vegas in 1880. And the business began to shift to other parts of the state. After that, they primarily shifted into wholesale business themselves, and they became suppliers. And after 1880, we started having other Jewish families coming in from Eastern Europe and coming into small towns all over New Mexico. And so the ILFELD became primarily the wholesaler to all of these business coming in various small towns around the state. One of the interesting characters is the nephew of Charles, Ludwig ILFELD. He stayed in Las Vegas, was an important figure there. And one of the high points for him, he loved horses. One of the high points for him was when Teddy Roosevelt came for the first reunion of the Rough Riders, many of whom had been recruited from New Mexico. Teddy actually rode one of Ludwig ILFELD's horses, which you can see on the left side of the screen here. So the Staub, the ILFELDs began to intermarry with the Staubs, and we began getting this large family network. Louis ILFELD married Anna, the oldest daughter of Abraham and Julia that we saw earlier. They were the first ones that actually moved to Albuquerque. They helped found the congregation Albert there. Louis was actually a member of the Constitutional Convention in 1910, getting ready for statehood. He helped found the Kiwanis Club. And another interesting thing, a unique thing about New Mexico, Luis and Noah actually helped found the Albuquerque Country Club in 1914. In Texas and in Arizona, when country clubs were formed, they were Anglo clubs. Jews had to form a separate one. In New Mexico, Jews helped form the country club. And that's a major thing that it tells about the situation of coexistence that happened here. You know, the Jews had an open participation. Bertha Staub is located all the way to the right, on the lower right of the photo. She was the daughter, after Julia became incapacitated, she was the hostess for the big house in Santa Fe for Abraham Staub. And she was an integral part of that family. In 1905, Max proposed marriage. It was a late marriage for both of them. But as you see, they were married. And they also moved to Albuquerque about this time when the ILFELD businesses were being moved there. So here we see them, Max Nordhaus with Bertha Staub Nordhaus, in their garden in Albuquerque. And they were there, Max died in 1936. Part of the thing I wanted to point out that's of interest, their son, Robert Nordhaus, became an important figure in civic affairs in Albuquerque later on. And Robert's son, William, you might recognize as being the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics from Yale University. He is from Albuquerque, of this Nordhaus family, and the brother of Elizabeth Nordhaus, who was giving me much of the information in relation to those families. I'd mentioned before that other Jewish families were coming into smaller towns all around the state, and here's a list of some of those families. It's not complete, but generally coming in and opening merchandise stores, mercantile. So thank you very much. I appreciate your interest in this early history of Jewish New Mexico and these early families. And so I think now if we'd like, we can perhaps go to question and answers.
Yes.
Or questions. I'm not sure about the answers, but at least questions.
Yeah, maybe we'll leave the slide up for, if anybody, if anybody wants to see that later, some more of the resources.
We can bring it back up, yeah.
Yeah, or we can share it with them afterwards too, so people could see it. Well, I don't see any questions that are posted. So if anyone
okay, well, there's something I can add to this if you'd like.
I can have a couple too. So you please add, and then I'll go ahead.
Okay. One of the interesting things is after the German Jewish families began coming in the 1800s, and then as we get into the early 1900s, the question always comes up: what about the conversos, the hidden Jews, the people of Jewish background who were here? One of the things we began to find is that some of the people who are New Mexicans, apparently of hidden Jewish backgrounds, began to pick up some of the customs from the German Jews who came in. Now, the hidden Jews who'd been here for 300 years, whatever, would have lost some of the things. But I think what happened, it's my interpretation, is they began to see something about openly practicing Jewish life. There were some of the things they began to pick up from that. And one of the things we began to see later on as we get into the 1900s, the appearance of Hebrew lettering on tombstones, gravestones. That was not something that had happened before that I'm aware of, and I don't know of any cases earlier on. But at least in the 1900s, we do begin to see Hebrew lettering occurring on people of New Mexican descent who were not openly Jewish, but obviously picking up something from their family memory or family background.
Yeah, and maybe you could do a presentation maybe on that at one point too, if that's a specialty. It's most definitely at the interest of a lot of people. We are having some questions pop up here too. So there was one, the Trinidad, Colorado, is the site the first synagogue in Colorado? And is there a connection to the New Mexico families?
There is actually the families in Raton and Clayton went to the Trinidad synagogue. So there's always been a connection with Trinidad. It's given its location, it's kind of the synagogue of northeastern New Mexico.
Okay, and then there's another question. Which buildings in Santa Fe were the Staub and Spielberg stores on the plaza?
You know, I don't know that their original stores survive even. Now the Catron building is there. That's a good question. I don't know the exact answer to that. Yeah.
There may be some images of those too, in like the Palace of the Governor's archives too, where people could probably look that
Right,
up.
right.
And then another one, Ron, why do you think there was little or no conflict between Jews and Catholics in New Mexico, and as there was elsewhere in what became the United States?
The first thing I think is it's the European connection between Archbishop Lamy and these early German families. And like we were saying, the Flora spoke French. So, you know, some of them did speak French. And it was, so there was that common connection of the European background, the European culture. They could discuss things. I think that's one of the key issues. You know, and another thing is there, you know, even given the conflict between the Catholic Church and the thing with the Jews, particularly as it happened in Spain. So part of our perception may be affected by the fact that the Catholic Church in Spain was so anti-Semitic that we have the impression that that was always the case. There are cases, particularly in the Americas and in the Northeast, where Jews and Catholics got along quite well, but frequently it had to do with common European backgrounds. You know, so I would think that's what was going on here.
And it seemed like there was a big relationship with other religions too, in some of the Jewish community too, because I know going over to Church of Holy Faith, there was a lot of Jewish influence on building that building, at least too, and monies. So,
and another interesting thing that you find with, again, touching on the converso, the hidden Jewish part of the population, when the United States came in and when Protestant churches came in, there were a number of these early families that left the Catholic Church to go to Protestant churches. And some of the descendants, those descendants are the ones now who are returning to the open practice of Judaism. So you do have this interesting link between Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish traditions that forms that kind of chain, you know. And many people today returning of Spanish-speaking background who are openly reclaiming Jewish identity came through that Protestant route to the present position.
So we have a few more questions. We'll see how many more we can get to. But are there many descendants of the Spiegelberg and ILFELD families? And she says, this is Karen Baker. She says, my great-grandparents were Herman ILFELD and Henrietta Spiegelberg.
To my knowledge, I think, I mean, there are descendants, but being New York based is my information. The Staubs and the ILFELDs and the Nordhaus have more, until more recently, were here in New Mexico in one, but the family eventually, you know, as we were seeing, moved more to Albuquerque because as it became the commercial center.
Yeah. And there's one comment that says the Nordhaus firm, Brian Colon says, the Nordhaus firm continues to be one of the preeminent law firms focusing on Native American and Indian law.
That's right. Yeah, Robert Nordhaus was the key figure there and was very much involved in defending Native American rights and actually won some major issues there.
And then I have a question of how did you start your interest in this history?
Oh, it's a long story. You know, it actually started because we lived many, many years in Colombia and South America. I'm an anthropologist, and I was doing work in Cartagena on some other issues, but Cartagena was one of the 3 sites of the Inquisition in the Americas. It was Mexico City, Cartagena, and Lima. I got interested in doing research on what happened in Cartagena with the Inquisition and the Jews who were arrested there, or the people who were of Jewish background who were arrested. From there, I went to the archives of the Spanish Inquisition in Madrid and read cases and did some archival work there. And then when we moved to Santa Fe, one of the first persons I met was Stanley Hordes. And of course, Stan had worked on all the information on the crypto-Jewish background here. And I became involved with the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And so it all developed out of that, you know. And one of the things, it was a pleasure a couple of years ago to work on the book, The Pioneer Jews, Pioneer Jewish Families of New Mexico, this was a publication with the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. That was a book edited by Noah Pogash and Richard Meltzer that I was mentioning earlier. And so I had the chance to get more into the individual stories of all of these families all over New Mexico. So it's been in stages, you know, developing like that.
Well, we have 3 more. I'll see what we can get to. But one that I think is interesting here, were there any Jewish cowboys?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes. You know, there's some really interesting Jewish stories. The Wertheim family, you know, here in Santa Fe, they're the ones who really have a tradition of cattle ranching and having land. And so the Wertheims can really bring us up to point on that. Another interesting thing, there are other links. In Deming, at one point there were a couple of Jewish brothers who went to Deming with the idea of they thought there was going to be a railhead, or that the railroad would arrive to Deming, and they, getting out in front of the railroad, they started a cattle business there and had everything set up so that they could collect cattle from the local ranchers and ship it east then on the railroad. The railroad didn't arrive there, as it turned out. That didn't work. But the wife of one of the guys who had this idea for the business was taking photographs. I'm going to forget her name right now, but it's all the History Museum has all these photos. It's a wonderful collection. Now these are not actually Jewish cowboys, but she did all the photo documentation. You know, this is again late 1800s, as I remember, of the local cowboys who were there, who were Hispanic cowboys. So probably the best documentation we have of cowboys from that early period is made by a Jewish woman photographer living in Deming at the time. And this collection is in the archives at the museum.
Huh. That's great. I'm going to try and look that out. So I'm going to see if I can throw a couple of more of these out, and then we'll stop for today. One person says, I visited the New Mexico Museum last year and noticed that the museum exhibit concerning the Spiegelbergs and others never made a reference to their being Jewish. I wonder why. Do you have any thoughts about this?
I don't. I'm not really sure. Yeah, that would is a central part of their story. And they were here. I mean, they were early settlers, and they were the people who really starting commerce, you know, and linking in with national commerce in the U.S. in those early years. So many, sometimes they were simply seen as early German settlers, and maybe, I guess, I'm not sure why there wasn't a recognition of the other piece of their heritage,
Yeah,
So.
that's probably a question for the curators too, maybe. Okay, I'm gonna do one more, I think, and then we'll, well, it's a little bit of a longer one, but I'll read this. From what I was told by my mother's family, this is from Penn Lafarge. The good reception of the Jews had to have. I'm sorry. From what I was told by my mother's family, the good reception of the Jews had to have with the good they brought to New Mexico, goods of all kinds, and the facts that they went to the trouble of making themselves part of the community. That is, they opened up the state, they learned the language, they gave to good causes. They were excellent citizens and did not keep apart as happened on the East Coast. Certainly, my mother's family was enormously proud of knowing all the Jewish families both in Las Vegas and Santa Fe. Okay, that was just a comment. So we'll do one more question then too, or slip in these couple of these questions. Was the merchant Gold family in Santa Fe also German immigrants? This person could find virtually no information on the family.
Yeah, and there were other early Jewish families here. I mentioned the Ellsberg and the Amsberg at one point, and we know, well, and later on, Spitz and the Moise family, for example, that was, they were in one of the small towns further east, but they also became involved in Santa Fe. So there were other families, and I didn't get into those because I wanted to get like the early big three families that kind of set the story. But there were other families coming in, especially later on in this process, and the descendants of many of those families are still here. Moise, the Spitz, Wertheims are still citizens here.
So if someone wanted to do further research, because there may be other questions, where would you suggest that they go? And then people can kind of look into these resources to look into when certain families arrived. Is there a good article where they could?
Okay. What I would suggest, literally, I think the starting point would be the publication from the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, which is the Pioneer Jewish Families of New Mexico. That is the best compilation I know of almost a dozen and a half families. There are many. They're not all the families, but many of them are there. So I would really suggest that is really the best place to start.
Good. Yes, because someone mentioned the Nussbaum family and asking when they might have arrived. So maybe like
the Nussbaum, yeah.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh no, go right ahead. Finish up that thought.
No, I was just going to say I don't have that date. I don't know exactly when they might have arrived. So.
Well, good. Well, I think that's all the questions we have. There's a few more little comments streaming down there if anybody wants to take a look at those, and including a link to the Jewish pioneer families. So, well, thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, this was fantastic, and thanks everyone for attending. And we'll have a recording of this sometime soon too. And if anyone wants to email me, Melanie@historicsantafe.org, if you have any comments about this presentation. It was our very first Zoom one, and then also about when the video may be posted. So,
if I could mention one last thing, tonight is actually the first night of Hanukkah on the Jewish calendar, and so it was appropriate, and it was fun to be able to do this literally just a couple of hours before we actually start the Hanukkah celebration this year. So thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ron. So everyone have a nice evening, and bye.
Okay.